New Zealand, or the land of the long white cloud, is a country familiar to most in the UK, even if they haven't visited it. This is probably because of the connection New Zealand has with the United Kingdom through the British Empire. It was in 1840 that New Zealand became the latest colony for the British Empire. 106 years later, New Zealand gained independence. However, Queen Elizabeth II is still the head of state to this day. The indigenous population, the Māori, had a different experience to colonialism to their neighbours, for example, the Aborigine in Australia. On the 6th of February 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed with Maori chieftains in the Bay of Islands, New Zealand. British sovereignty was declared on the 21st of May 1840. However, the Maori had suffered, like the Aborigine in Australia, with conflict with Europeans and introduced diseases for at least a century before this. Many British people can claim a link with New Zealand on their family tree and vice versa. This is through immigration or emigration. Now, I always get these two terms muddled up. Immigration is entering a foreign country to live. Immigration is leaving a country to live in another. They still sound similar, don't they? But I think there's a subtle difference. Now, of course, anyone who is white, European descent in New Zealand must have ancestry from outside of New Zealand, unless they're Maori. So how do you find your ancestors in New Zealand? This video will give you some key websites, some tips and techniques around searching the New Zealand genealogy records. Modern New Zealand history arguably starts in 1840, but this is disputed because it doesn't recognise the immigration that had been going on for thousands of years before this. The Maori, who are the indigenous population, and their ancestors have been arriving for at least 1,000 years before 1840. However, for this video and genealogy records, we'll take 1840 as our starting point. In 1840, the population of the indigenous Maori was 70,000. Compare that to a European population of 2,000. However, by 1858, these numbers had reversed. There were 59,000 European as opposed to 56,000 Maori. If we move forward to 1896, then the population has increased again. The European population now stands at 701,000, whilst the Maori population had reached its lowest recorded level at 42,000. Today, June 2018, the estimated total population of New Zealand is just over 4,800,000 people. So we can see why genealogy and interest from the United Kingdom with British and Irish families particularly, New Zealand is an interesting country to look at for our family tree. That level of immigration. Of course, anyone who lives in New Zealand today that isn't of Maori descent must have ancestors outside of New Zealand, and most of those ancestors will have come from Britain and Ireland. Immigration was encouraged by legislation, and this legislation favoured European immigrants rather than any other nationality, and therefore most immigrants were British and Irish. This, after all, was a British colony in 1840. People were attracted to various jobs, the main ones being labourers, agriculturalists, craftsmen and domestic servants. Why did people travel all the way to New Zealand other than for work? Well, the advertising was very good as well. Private companies and government organisations got involved. Private companies like the New Zealand company ended up attracting 20,000 people to New Zealand. Local and provincial governments offered incentives, free passage or free land on arrival. Even religious organisations, one such, the Anglican Experiment, encouraged people with assisted passage. So there was a lot of opportunity in New Zealand, and a lot of people made the journey to New Zealand to find work, to settle and to raise new families. So if we come to immigration records to start with, most of these records are held in Wellington, the capital of New Zealand. Other regional centres such as Auckland, Dunedin do hold records, but Wellington is your best bet. Coming up now is a website link which you will need to perhaps pause the video and copy down and then enter into your web browser. This gives you access to the following types of records: shipping records, immigration between 1840 and 1880, immigration between 1880 and 1970, specific groups or nationalities, emigration, and other sources of immigrant information. So check out that website and have a look at immigration records. How about birth, marriage and death records, BMD? Well, these records have been standardised in New Zealand since 1856, although the government did start collecting birth, marriage and death registrations from 1847. Before 1848, like the UK, you'll be relying on parish records, church records. Registration for birth, marriage and death has been compulsory for white New Zealanders since 1847. For Māori, since 1911 for marriages, and 1913 for birth and death. Now, like Australia, birth, marriage and death registrations in New Zealand are restricted. Births are more heavily restricted than marriages or deaths. So, for example, a birth certificate may well be closed for 100 years. Let's look at those closure periods in more detail. So, births, as I mentioned, are closed for 100 years. Stillbirths are closed that occurred in the last 50 years or more. Marriages are closed that occurred in the last 80 years. And deaths that occurred in the last 50 years, or if the deceased date of birth was at least 80 years ago, those records are closed. Coming up now are a few other websites that you might find useful. Again, you will need to pause your video, make a note of the website addresses and enter them into your browser. I hope you have a lot of luck with searching for your New Zealand ancestors, and like me, you find some connections with New Zealand. With the number of British and Irish ancestors that travelled to New Zealand, settled there, maybe never came back but made a life in New Zealand, I'm pretty certain that at some stage you will find a New Zealand ancestor. Also, at the end of this video is a couple of links to material that I've used to research this video. Thank you for listening and good luck with your research. What stories might your ancestors tell?